Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon to our students, colleagues, and friends here in the United States, all around Africa, and the rest of the world. I am Dr. Flordelise Beguerin, or Flori, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of African Studies here at Howard University in Washington, D.C. I want to give a special warm welcome to our French-speaking audience. For the very first time, we are presenting the African Archaeology Lecture Series with French captions. So to my French-speaking audience, salutations à tous, bons après-midi à vous, chers étudiants, collègues et amis. Je suis le docteur Flordelise Beguerin, ou Flori, professeur associé au département des études africaines ici, à l'Université Howard. Merci de vous être joint à nous aujourd'hui. I hope I said that correctly, but welcome to our annual Distinguished African Archaeological Lecture. I would like to extend my gratitude to our sponsors who make this event possible. This lecture is co-sponsored by the DC Archaeological Institute of America, the Howard University Center for African Studies, the Howard University Department of African Studies, and the Howard University Archaeology Working Group. I extend my sincere thanks to everyone who has supported this series. And now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Shadreck Chirikure. Professor Chirikure holds the Edward Hall Professorship of Archaeological Science at the University of Oxford and is director of the Research Laboratory for Archaeology and the History of Art, which is a central component of the School of Archaeology. He also serves as a British Academy Global Professor. Professor Chirikure has received numerous fellowships and awards. Currently, he is Fellow of the British Academy. In 2022, he was honored as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. In 2021, he was a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. In 2019, he received the Shanghai Archaeology Forum Research Award. And in 2018, he was awarded the British Academy Global Professorship. His research interests are vast and diverse and include archaeometallurgy, human material relations, innovation, knowledge, technology, society, ancient technologies, archaeological science, globalization, heritage science, and sustainability. Without further ado, I am delighted to present Professor Shadreck Chirikure and his talk, When Informants Become Knowledge Producers, Rethinking Great Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much. When you were speaking, I said, oh, those are too many titles for one person. Can you see my screen? Okay, fantastic. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for tuning in to this conversation around Great Zimbabwe. I have deliberately chosen a topic that is quite provocative, and we'll try also to be provocative, and hopefully that will stimulate discussion towards the end. And I will give you a little bit of background on where this is coming from. So I was born and grew up in an area which is about 45 minutes away from Great Zimbabwe, and participating in the value systems of groups of people that are known as the Shona people. So later on, I then became an archaeologist. So looking back then, what happens when people who are mostly archaeologists have a tendency of going to villages, communities, ask for information so that they can write their books, they can get promotion, and so on. So what happens? Because my village is about, as I said, 45 minutes away from Great Zimbabwe. So what happens when archaeologists come to my village? They ask, how do you do these things, right? When I am now an archaeologist and I have swapped roles, what happens? How do I approach a place such as Great Zimbabwe? So this is where I am coming from, and I'm also going into some of the details of a book which I recently did on Great Zimbabwe, and will engage with various elements of interest from there. So I thought about starting with a little bit of self-promotion. So this is just a 2-second, 3-second clip. Hopefully the technology will work.
Great Zimbabwe is an outstanding example of a pre-colonial sub-Saharan African state. It was at its height between the 13th and mid-16th century. It's as important as Machu Picchu or the Egyptian pyramids, and yet it is far less frequently visited or understood. Shadreck Chirikure, a Zimbabwean archaeologist who grew up near the site, is trying to change that. Great Zimbabwe is, says Mr. Chirikure, a symbol not just of Africa's power and potential, but of how outsiders have all too often told African stories and got them wrong. The Great Enclosure is a triumph of engineering, made up of more than 1 million granite stones, stacked 11 meters high and 250 meters round, without a drop of mortar. African history remains dogged by outdated assumptions, partly because of a lack of African perspectives. Mr. Chirikure is among those changing that.
Okay, so this is a clip which the Economist magazine produced. And just to preface, but I want to start with an anecdote, right? This is the reason why I have this picture of myself is just to remind you folks that at some point I was young. But anyway, I want to draw your attention. If you can see my laser, there are these floors here. These floors where people sit. So this is a village in southwestern Zimbabwe, a place known as Gwanda, right? And we do research in the area. So sometime around 2007 or thereabout, I went to the field with the colleagues, and one of them was asking me, how did the people make these floors in the villages, right? So I told them that, well, you go, you look for anthill clay, you pound it, you process it, mix it with water. Sometimes you add timber, and then you have to compact it with a special tool. And after that, you will have to polish it to give it a very nice surface, and then you can apply cow dung after it has dried. So, and indeed, to the credit of my colleague, in the paper which he produced, he also cited me and said this is the source of the information. So far, so good. 7 years later, in 2014, I published a paper which was talking about the origins of socio-political complexity in Southern Africa, and actually used the evidence of the flows that we got to say, well, these features are the same as what we use elsewhere as the indicators of socio-political complexity. The response then was that no, actually, you cannot identify flaws. What you are calling flaws are not flaws, right? But this is from the person that I told how these flaws are built, right? So this is where this is coming from, right? When I am the informant, I'm not doubted. My information is good. It can be used and published in a journal. When I write about the same thing myself, then I don't know it. I need to be corrected by the person that I told how it's done. Right. So, what are the implications in terms of the practice of archaeology and in terms of knowledge production? Yes, I was the informant who was saying these floors are built like this, and so on. So, what happens when I encounter Great Zimbabwe? When I engage with this archaeology, how do I approach it, and with what consequences? What new meanings emerge? This is what we will be engaging with for the rest of this lecture. So here is what one might call a punchline. Why must we rethink Great Zimbabwe? Is it even necessary, right? So my argument is that Great Zimbabwe has never been a local nor an African affair. In fact, it represents a confiscated past, initially by antiquarians and subsequently by professional archaeologists of all colors. So as a community member, I don't really identify much with the Great Zimbabwe, particularly in terms of some of the narratives that we are made to read and some of the narratives that we engage with, right? So that's a very big provocation. Why am I saying this? I will provide some statements to back up this, but like I said, this is a provocation which is hopefully meant to help us to think about the way in which we practice archaeology and the way in which we engage with each other. All of these ideas they are in this book, Great Zimbabwe: Reclaiming a Confiscated Past, which has been doing very well. Within 3 months of publication, it was already on paperback. So that's doing it has been doing quite well. And what does reclaiming a confiscated past even mean? Right. If I may take a step back, and who has the monopoly over the past? Who has the legitimate right to interpret Great Zimbabwe, right? Is it the archaeologist? Is it the local community? Or is it anyone who is interested in the past, right? How do we take it then if someone then said, no, my story is the only one, whatever version you have, it doesn't count. So that is also one of the challenges, particularly when it comes to dealing with Great Zimbabwe. That is, there are these competing narratives, but who has the monopoly of the past? At some point, a colleague once remarked that I cannot spend 10 years of study at university to be told by a local community what to do, because I am the expert and they learn from me, right? But coming from the other side, where I'm also part of that group that is normally informants, how does that work? And if I were to engage with Great Zimbabwe, how would I do things differently or similarly? The other question as well is that the other issue, if you can see my sensor, there's this bead here, this glass bead. So this is the Carton Thompson's the Zimbabwe culture. So when found at K2 or Mapungubwe, these glass beads, what are known, some call them garden rollers, others call them wound beads. This bead here, it is a symbol associated with prestige, with the elites, and so on. But when you find it at Great Zimbabwe, rather, it has a different meaning. The question then is why? Who is telling these stories? Why is this important in the Shasha-Limpopo, and it dates to what is known as the K2 period, or the time period around AD 1000. There it's important. When you have it at Great Zimbabwe, well, it's not that important. So who has a monopoly over the past, and who can tell stories, and whose stories must be believed, and whose should not be believed? Great Zimbabwe is also a textbook example of the effects of colonialism. In fact, archaeology is one of those disciplines that got exported to different parts of the world as an accessory to empire. So when some of the earliest archaeologists, antiquarians went to Great Zimbabwe, they thought that, oh, wow, this is this is super advanced. These local people could not have done it. So in other words, they had no capacity to build Great Zimbabwe. And as a result, what is known as the Zimbabwe controversy, which Bruce Trigger and others have written about, ensued. That is state-sponsored excavations to demonstrate that Great Zimbabwe was not built by Africans, but instead was built by people from the Middle East. Of course, this was all to do with the colonial project seeking the justification to say, okay, because this place was, or this region was colonized previously, so what we are doing perhaps is there's nothing wrong with that. We are only following precedents. So that is the situation in which Great Zimbabwe's encounter with the world started, where it was believed that, well, it was not built by Africans. So that is, meanwhile, all this debate was taking place amongst Westerners. Africans were not part of that. They were not part of that debate. Discussions were taking place in London. They were taking place in Cape Town, but not in any of the surrounding villages. So it was just people who were coming from Europe and the United States who were debating among themselves. So that is also perhaps, like I said, the first confiscation of the past. And indeed, it was also big business, where people were excavating the sediments at Great Zimbabwe and finding themselves some gold, some treasure. What you are seeing here is all solid gold, 99.99% gold, which was excavated, sieved, and no one knows what happened to it. There was a company which was formed by Cecil John Rhodes, which was known as the Ancient Ruins Company, which was formed specifically to prospect for gold in these ancient ruins. And quite a lot of, if you read Richard Hall and Neil's 1902 book, they have a catalog of gold that they got from these places. In one place, they had more than 21 kilograms. And so on. So that was quite a lucrative business. The archaeology was not respected, and the main preoccupation then was to find evidence of builders from the Middle East. So the destructive activities of the antiquarians, those folks who were looking for gold and the like, that galvanized the British Society for the Advancement of Science into action. They seconded initially David Randall McIver here with the donkey somewhere in central Zimbabwe. This is around 1905. I think it's it looks like cool. Next time I'll try to have, to try and do my field work on donkey as well and see how far it works. So, but that's 1905. That's Randall McIver, and this is Kathleen Kenyon, and here this is Gertrude Keaton Thompson. So initially, 1905. David Randall McIver did excavations. He concluded that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, and but there was quite some debate, some disagreement. And in 1928, another team was seconded, and that was led by Gertrude Keaton Thompson, and that was an all-female led team. I'll come back to the significance of this later. And they also concluded that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, but some of the conclusions are bordered on racism, because one of the reasons why it would have been built by Africans was that it looked like the product of an infantile mind, which after learning how to do something can then repeat and repeat and repeat it. So even if it was given to Africans, but still, it was, within this racist kind of paradigm. The main point, though, is that the conclusion was Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. And this is Keaton Thompson's book, which he did very well. At the time it was published, and this is also David Randall McIver's book, which he during his time it was also one of those bestsellers. But in as much as archaeologically this advanced understanding, right? These books were never aimed for the common woman or common man in the local villages. The consumers of this knowledge were either in Cape Town, London, Berlin, or New York. That had nothing to do with the local people. So that is also another confiscation of the past. And even after Keaton Thompson, that was also followed by some of the best works ever done at Great Zimbabwe, particularly by a team led by Roger Summers, Keith Robinson, and Anthony Whitty, and even after that, the very invaluable contributions of Tom Huffman. But and also after independence, we have Innocent Pikirai and others. But professional archaeology further alienated the discipline from the communities. And the results of archaeological work, they were presented in Cape Town, in London, but not in any of the local villages. In fact, I haven't seen any work that is written in the local Shona language talking about Great Zimbabwe. Even the official guides, they are all written in English. Of course, I also take the blame because I also work there and I speak the language. Why haven't I written something in the Shona language? So I'm not excluding myself from the blame. The reality is that as a profession, we are taking away the past from the people. So that's what I mean by this confiscation. How can we right this wrong? I will come back to this towards the end. So this is a picture from the National Archives of Zimbabwe, taken in the 1890s, and these are the local chiefs, Mugabe and his clan members. So these are the people that were providing the information to David Randall McIver. They are the people who were giving information to Gertrude Keaton Thompson, but nowhere are they cited in those works. In fact, they are only referred to as my Mugabe informant my rosy informant, and so on. So they are anonymized and erased from history. But whoever contributed from the British side, their names are known. That's why we know that there was Kathleen Kenyon, there was so and so as part of that delegation. So there is erasure in terms of the contribution of these people who contributed to the production of what knowledge of what we call Great Zimbabwe, and yet we don't acknowledge them in the stories that we tell about the site. Neither do we engage with their descendants. So archaeology then, the archaeology of Great Zimbabwe then, in some ways, is this elitist club made of us archaeologists, and then we can also even prevent members of the public from enjoying by using our complex jargon and so on. So this is one of the ways in which the past has been taken away from the local people. And even in terms of our theoretical approaches, there's a time in Southern Africa when the remnants of the new archaeology were quite strong. That archaeology is a science, and that its purpose was to develop hypotheses, test those hypotheses with data to produce general laws. And when you have those general laws, you can then use them to predict human behavior. So there was a time when this positivist strand was quite strong. And it was also claimed that local narratives only make sense when interpreted by archaeologists. So if you are from the village and you have your own narratives, they have no place because they are not scientific. Or in other words, the general laws do not predict the reality that they contain them. So the effect of that paradigm was that it further dislocated Great Zimbabwe from indigenous communities. Even if the same communities provided the ethnographies, provided the oral traditions, but when archaeologists synthesized that and imprinted that onto a template of scientific archaeology, then the locals didn't matter. So that is also another confiscation, that very, very extractive behavior. We go and dig, take what we can take, but when it comes to the results, forget about them. They don't matter. It's only about us. So this is one of the reasons then why I decided to have a look, rethink Great Zimbabwe, and also recalling Peter Gallick, who was a British architect, later on trained as an archaeologist, worked at Great Zimbabwe, produced a book by the name of Great Zimbabwe in 1973. The book was arguing that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, and the then colonial government exiled him for that. So, and then that's why Peter Gallick later on went to work in Nigeria, and he has done some fantastic work there. But in 1980, Zimbabwe got independence, and Peter Gallick asked this question that since the 1890s up to 1980, Great Zimbabwe was just a discussion, a preserve of archaeologists from the Euro-American world. So the question that he asked was that, where are the native archaeologists? And I'm quoting here his 1982 paper in the journal Africa, Prehistory and Ideology in Zimbabwe. is the title of the paper. So which also has resonance to what another great son of Africa, Chinua Achebe, has also written about in a 1994 interview, where he emphasized this proverb that until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. So decided then to take up Peter Galleck's challenge and say that what happens if I use my village experience and go and work at Great Zimbabwe? Will I reach the same interpretation? So during the Zimbabwe got independence in 1980, and Great Zimbabwe gave its name to the country. So perhaps the only archaeological site in the world to give its name to a country, right? And also Independence Day celebration, Bob Marley played. That's when he played that track, Zimbabwe. So what a momentous occasion. 1980, Great Hope. We have Peter Galleck asking the question, where are the Africans? Can you write this archaeology from your village experience? We also want to learn. But what happened was that academia, by its nature, is a cumulative field. We build on what exists. So what we have tended to do in the post-colony is to follow the traditions that are existing. And that also perpetuated the confiscation of the past from the local communities, because it was more of the same and nothing changed, right? The local communities continued to be marginalized. And because of that scientific paradigm that I mentioned, they were also, in some cases, challenged for being unscientific and for being non-experts. So it must be for us, the archaeologists. We have spent 10 years studying. So what can the community members tell me about that? I am the expert. But if you have lived for 80 years of your life in the same village, surely that's more than 10 years. But anyway, that's a point for another day. So the main question, the main challenge that I encountered then was that okay, I am an archaeologist, and I'm also trained in the same school, in the same traditions that I'm accusing of confiscating the past from the local communities. So how do we reclaim that confiscated past? How do we take it? How do we take it back? How do we bring the communities into the center of knowledge production and consumption at Great Zimbabwe? At that point, I went to the Cape Verde. The legacy of Amilcar Cabral, particularly in one of his essays, where he talks about a metaphoric class suicide. So Cabral was talking about this, was asking this question to the leaders of nationalist movements across the continent. So, and he is asking the question, what do we want to do with independence when we get it, right? And then he said, the African nationalists had two choices. The first one was to gain independence, occupy the positions which the colonial administrators had, create a new class of elites, and forget about the masses, and let them suffer. The other option, which Cabral put on the table, was that the nationalist leaders, as the bourgeois, they needed to commit metaphoric class suicide, right? Sacrifice the position, the privileges, and everything, and redesign a society that is inclusive and a society that responds to the needs of common women and common men in the village and in the street. Well, how did the African nationalists respond to this challenge? We know the result, don't we? They just simply replaced the African nationalists and They simply replaced the colonial elites with new forms of elites, even with worse corruption and so on, such that standards of living went the other way, and so on. As an archaeologist, then, is it possible to perform class suicide, throw away some of the tools from the discipline, and then rebuild from scratch and come up with the knowledge and an understanding which resonates with the community? What will the professionals say? These are the challenges that I encountered. But I thought of trying, or if I fail, at least I will be somewhere close. Then I encountered the post-colonial contradiction, which Partha Chatterjee and others have written about, particularly in The Nation and its fragments. Dipesh Chakrabarty has also written about that. So the question is that in the post-colony, we realize the inadequacies and acknowledge the inadequacies of the tools that are available to us for writing histories, including using archaeology, right? But these tools are part and parcel of the empire. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that problem? That we want to go to a certain space where we produce knowledge that is relevant to our purposes, that identifies, that is inclusive, and hopefully that can move our societies forward. But at the same time, the tools that we are using are the tools of the very same empire, the tools of the very same colony that we fought. An easier but very difficult to implement suggestion would be that we come up with our own ways. And what's that way? So that's a contradiction which I had to grapple with, but I found a way which is like a middle range, where how do we bring in the village experience into an archaeological lab and come up with a narrative that is mutually understandable, particularly by the many consumers. So one of the things that I've done then is to use Shona concepts, with the understanding that the very notion of Shona itself is a colonial invention. Before the 1890s or thereabout, there was no unified entity called Shona. People were referring to themselves using different groups. But I also drew from African concepts of time, territory, and also music, proverbs, and the like. That is where I got the body of knowledge to animate, to breathe life into the archaeology of Great Zimbabwe, to rethink how it emerged, how it flourished, and perhaps how it also collapsed. So when you are also dealing with the Great Zimbabwe, we also need to keep in mind that the Great Zimbabwe of the 21st century or the 20th century is different to the Great Zimbabwe of the late 19th century. There are many things that were added. Land was parceled, and so for you to be able to interpret Great Zimbabwe, you need to excavate these layers to be able to understand what has been added through time before. Otherwise, you can make interpretations that are not sound. I have also made the same mistake myself. That's where I learned about it, because Adam Renda had a marketplace at Great Zimbabwe near the museum in the 1860s. And sometimes you find the 19th century European porcelain at Great Zimbabwe, and you say, what is it doing? Until you realize that, no, this was actually a market, and isolate that element there are some things that you can take and assume that they were used in the deep past when they were part of the layers that are accumulating in the biography of Great Zimbabwe. So that's why why I had to do this exercise. And also, Great Zimbabwe is thoroughly westernized, even today. It is made up of the hill complex, the valley enclosures, and the great enclosures. But the names of the ruins of the constituent parts, this is Posselt ruin after Harry Posselt, that infamous guy who stole one of the Zimbabwe birds and sold it to Cecil John Rhodes. So if you go to Great Zimbabwe, you will see Posselt ruin even today. You will also see Renda as ruin. So his name was Adam Renda, the trader that I mentioned. His market was here, where we have the 3660 condor, where my laser is. That is where his market was. And Karl Mauck was a German geologist, explorer, who is reputed, or who is known to be the first European to report about Great Zimbabwe. So that's Great Zimbabwe at the moment. So a basic question would be, what are the local names for these places? Are they not there? Can we not use them so that perhaps we can connect to the local communities and the like? And also, when you talk of Great Zimbabwe, there is a very strong monumental bias that the preoccupation is on those dry stone walls. They are pretty amazing, built using the precise placement method without any binder such as a mortar, 4 meters wide at the base, 2 meters wide at the top, right? Impressive, 11 meters high. So that's where most of the attention is. But there are also these settlements, these unwalled settlements. So, for example, there was a golf course at Great Zimbabwe on these unwalled settlements. So no impact assessments were done. This is in the early 20th century, where people just decided to add extra attractions by building a golf course, because the attraction at the time was the monumental architecture. Even this curio shop is built on top of floors that housed a section of the town. So those are some of the issues associated with the Great Zimbabwe. And this is the little site museum at Great Zimbabwe, what is known as the Camp Ruins. And the name Camp is coming from the British South Africa Company, because on the way from South Africa to colonize what is now Zimbabwe, they camped there. So that is the name of that is where the name Camp Ruins is coming from, which is why I was saying, well, is indeed time to change some of these names. And also during that early 20th century, Great Zimbabwe was like a free-for-all. Collectors, interested people would come and grab whatever they can, with the result that Great Zimbabwe is the collections from Great Zimbabwe are widely dispersed all over the world, some in public repositories, others in private collections. I get emails from private collectors from time to time. I have these things from Great Zimbabwe. Are you interested in them? I have this thing from my grandfather. Can I leave it with you? I have these photographs. So that's part and parcel of Great Zimbabwe, and how dispersed widely it is. So chronology is a very important dimension, particularly for us archaeologists. If we think in three dimensions, the XYZ parameters, or even in 2 dimensions, when it's the horizontal space, and then the vertical, which is time, because time allows us to understand how things have developed through time. But also, time is one of the ways in which we tend to exclude and marginalize communities, particularly when we use some of these concepts of time. So what I tried to do was to merge the local concepts of time. So in the Shona language, time is known as Ngua, and the time is cyclical, right? It's not linear. So this is one of the concepts that I took, where the past, the present, and the future, they are distinct time slices, but the past informs the present, and the present informs the future. So when you are in the present, you live with the past, and you also live with the future. What are the implications of that when it comes to interpreting a Harris matrix in archaeology? How do you disentangle? How do you reconcile those different epistemologies and those different ontologies? So some of the concepts coming out of the local understanding of time then is that the past is not always in the past, and the present is not always in the present. That's why you have people that when they die, they become ancestors, and ancestors are the living dead. They are ever present to guide the living, right? And you seek wisdom. You seek wisdom from the ancestors. So yes, they are gone, but they are with you, right with you, and so on. So because of that, this secularity, what does the sedimentation of the past into the soil over generations mean? What does it mean locally in terms of thinking about generations and so on? So these local teleologies are some of the concepts that I used to think about the development of Great Zimbabwe. And also, can we reconcile this with the Western conception of time? So this is one of the excavations that I led at Great Zimbabwe in 2018. So the purpose was to restore this wall, but also to understand the evolution of the settlement. And can we do away with the periodization? Hobst has raised this question where he says these boundaries, these fine boundaries that we impose, particularly in terms of the Harris matrices and so on, we are pigeonholing events into certain segments which might not have applied in the past, but we also exclude so many things. And recalling Johannes Fabian and his famous book Time and the Other, where Fabian, apart from arguing that some of the ethnographers working in the 20th century did not believe that they were living in the same time as the Africans or the people that they were studying, at least time can also be used to confiscate and to take away things. If it is of a different time, then it's not us, and you can use it for different ends. So what I then decided to do was to apply radiocarbon dating to determine when things happened, but not to impose hard and fast boundaries, which is a retrospective periodization. So apply local concepts of change. Can we come up with a dynamic understanding of the chronology of Great Zimbabwe? So the result was that the chronology that we ended up had so many continuities between the periods, and one could see the evolution of the settlement, and which has led to one of the major points of discussions we are having in terms of what is the origins of Great Zimbabwe. Did it originate from Mapungubwe? When that glass bead I showed you is a K2 glass bead when you are in the Shashilimpopo, and we have since found more than 50 of those. So can the origins of Great Zimbabwe then be local, right? That's the big discussion point at the moment. How about the material culture of Great Zimbabwe? How does it look like? These are some of this is the Shona village, which is a creative reconstruction of, thinking how the houses at Great Zimbabwe would have looked like. So these are the remains, some of the remains of the houses, solid earthen structures, plastered and then perhaps fired, but has survived the passage of time. 800 survived for more than 800 years or so. These are some of the houses, the furniture and the compartments. But the questions could be, what events are set in these houses and their features? Can we reconstruct social relations and so on? These are some of the and also these are some of the most impressive walls at Great Zimbabwe. And what is the local classification? Well, Anthony Whitty's classification uses an aesthetic logic, where you have the RPQR, poorly caused, neatly caused, and so on. But in the local language, a stone wall is a stone wall. They are all known as Masvingo or Zimbabwe. That's it. That this aesthetic, of course, it helps us to build chronologies and so on. But in terms of significance and meaning, it doesn't have much. I'm not saying that local people have no sense of aesthetic. I'm saying that they have a sense of aesthetic, but they did not use it for the purposes of chronology. And these are some of the local ports. That's how they look like. And archaeologists have performed some seriation, Keith Robinson, Tom Huffman, and showed that the shapes, they have evolved through time. And we are doing some residue analysis to reconstruct the foods that were prepared there, and sorghum, millets, beans. These are some of the indicators that we are finding. And what we've also done is to use local names to try and identify what shapes have what shapes are resilient, what shapes have persisted through time. So the classification that we are now having is anchored in that local classification system, where if we are bringing in local people and tell them that this is a hajgana, which is a cooking vessel, then they will identify, they will know it. And use, of course, using multiple languages. These are some of the material cultures. So the crafting, these are clapperless iron gongs. They produce some very nice music. If you had invited me in person, I would have played you the music and perhaps dance to that, but there's always the next time. So clapperless gongs, spindle whorls, and these copper bronze sheeting, which was attached to post holes for decoration. So a vibrant place for crafts. And then there's also this coin with Arabic inscription, which was recovered by Tom Huffman in 1971, and is pointing to connections to the Swahili world. And these are things from China. Some crotals, perhaps a candle stand, and that bronze bell, a jade teapot, and so on. Quite stunning. So this is, but the key question is, what is the significance of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 objects in terms of the materialization of power, right? How does possession of these things enable a king or a queen to rule an empire which is more than 50,000 square kilometers in size? What is the significance of this? What are they used for? So locally, what do they mean? These are some of the issues that we are engaging with, and also that's a much the color photograph of that teapot and a different elevation. Glass beads, blue and white porcelain, but there's also a very strong local economy within Great Zimbabwe, cattle production, even the weaving that I mentioned, agriculture, and many other things. So within Great Zimbabwe, the tendency has always been to be Indian Ocean centric. That is consider exotics from the Indian Ocean. But what is the role of exotics from Africa? So this map is just giving you an idea of how big Africa is. You can fit the United States, China, India, Western Europe, and be left with spare territory. So that's how big Africa is. And some of the distances involved are 2,000, 3,000 kilometers. Flying from London to Vienna is 1,000, is about 1,000 kilometers or so. So that's you know, that's a very small distance. And we talk of exotics when we are in the context of Europe. In the context of Great Zimbabwe, why can't we talk of exotics from other parts of Africa? For example, these clapperless gongs, copper ingots, and many other things. So all of these contributed to the economy of Great Zimbabwe, and shows that Great Zimbabwe was connected within the region and also outside of it via the Indian Ocean. How did Great Zimbabwe rise and decline? What are some of the factors behind this rise? So religion is one of the major factors, particularly a holistic religion that comprises elements of healing, divination, praying for rain, and thanksgiving. We see material culture pointing to that, those soapstone beds, soapstone bowls, and the other thing. So religion is also associated with fertility of the land, particularly when people ask for rain and the like, and the ancestors of the royal families, in most cases, they are responsible for the fertility and also for the well-being of the whole nation. So this is why religion would have been an important component, and crafts, as well as these figurines, speaking to the economy, but tied to cosmologies of production, and also the gold being worked within the same value systems. Then issues of land control, cattle raising, some of the work we have done with strontium isotopes, Judith Seeley and others, is indicating that some of the cattle that were consumed at Great Zimbabwe is coming from distances that are as far as 200 kilometers. So that's quite a broad spectrum economy covering distances. Of course, there's also gold and glass beads, some of which some of the gold was locally used. The rest was also exported. So it's a mix of factors responsible for the rise of Great Zimbabwe, but perhaps local agency is more important. The Indian Ocean factors, they only magnified a process that was already underway. And in a way, if we say that Great Zimbabwe was built using proceeds from the Indian Ocean, it's not different to saying that the local people have not done it anyway, just that this time is coming from the Indian Ocean. How about decline? the big question then is, do social systems collapse? Which takes us to Norman Yoffe's book, questioning collapse. And there is evidence that Great Zimbabwe did decline by the 1600s. The level of activity had shrunk. Circumstances in terms of trade, perhaps environmental circumstances, and so on. But by the mid 17th century, there isn't much that was happening at Great Zimbabwe. But indeed, if we combine all the evidence from material culture and the like, Great Zimbabwe was an urban center. It was the capital of a very successful state that controlled a very huge area. This is the landscape where Great Zimbabwe would have obtained its resources from. And like I said, isotope geochemistry is suggesting that that was true, even pointing to distances that are longer than what is shown here. So as I draw to an end, just to say that in terms then of reclaiming Great Zimbabwe, those local understandings, local value systems, they are showing the value of performing or conducting an archaeology that is locally understood. And now we have so many points of engagement with the local communities. When I gave them copies of my book, we can engage in a discussion, because this is something which they understand. So my next challenge then is to translate or to write something in the local Shona language and see how that goes. But just to say that in global archaeology, Great Zimbabwe is also very important, because some of the methods that are now normative, that are now influential in the discipline, they were pioneered at Great Zimbabwe by Catton Thompson and others. So you can't talk of archaeology in the British Empire without talking about Great Zimbabwe. And as I end, just to say that what I'm talking about builds on the works that Webandoro and others have done. Just Fontaine has also contributed on that. But yes, you might ask me, reclaiming a confiscated past, what's next? So doing an archaeology that is informed by the local concepts, and that is informed by the local value systems, and that allows the local value systems to challenge some of the scientific principles. If one can find that balance, then hopefully the communities and other users of the past will also find a stake for themselves. And what's next? The next thing, like I said, is writing in the local knowledge. Is also to make sure that the lessons that we are getting from Great Zimbabwe, we use them to improve lives in the present. And is that possible? Can we learn about sustainability from looking at Great Zimbabwe and so on? I think I would like to end on a more optimistic note and say, yes, it is very, very, very possible. And if you think you are too small to make a change, then you haven't spent a night with a mosquito. If you have spent with a mosquito night with a mosquito, you know what that sound means. These are some of the organizations that have supported my research at Great Zimbabwe. And with that, I thank you for listening.
That was wonderful. Thank you. We have a couple of minutes for some questions. If anybody has a question, can you please hit your raised hand icon? We have one question in the chat. Let's see. Oh, let's see. One question. What role can Zimbabwean scholars assert the value of oral tradition into the intellectual canon, making room for increased value addition to the global academic realm? This is a question by Rodney Smith.
Hi, Rodney. Thank you for your question. It's just it was a question of emphasis, but oral traditions play or have played, and they continue to play an important role in our understanding of Great Zimbabwe, because they are testimonies passed by word of mouth from generation to generation. We could not even interpret some of the functions of the spaces at Great Zimbabwe without oral traditions. So they have been built. Joost Fontaine drew quite a lot from oral traditions. Weber has done the same. I was more influenced by material culture, but paying homage to oral traditions. The interesting thing about oral traditions, though, is that how do we deal with the feedback process between the written and the oral? Because what was oral in the 1890s was written, and then that's what we read in the books. And the people have now, gone to school and so on. So if we go and ask the same people, what information do they give us? Is it from the books? Is it from the, we can't resolve that question today. I'm just highlighting that feedback challenge between sources. But nevertheless, yes, oral traditions are a powerful, valuable, and important source of information.
Great. Deandra Blake has a question. Deandra, can you unmute yourself, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Thank you for the beautiful presentation. I was wondering, what do you hope for the future of African archaeology with your work with Great Zimbabwe? And how do you think academia can contribute to maintenance the maintenance of culture, especially with working local communities?
I was getting some parts, but not others. Flori, did you get the question? Could you please repeat it for me?
Deandra, could you please drop your question into the chat? And in the meantime, Faya, I think you had a question as well. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask? I think you're still muted. Faya, you're still muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. My question is with regards to the role of the memory play in sustainable development with regards to the book. Probably my question is more versed on how does cultural memory can be a foundation of, sustainable development, by example, instilling the respect for that traditional knowledge and practice which was integrated within the Great Zimbabwe and their vision for sustainability. How could that help to suggest that some form of, injustice informs to, delete and also helps to come up with a more sustainable future?
But thank you, William. That is a very important question. Yes, Great Zimbabwe the advantage of archaeology in general is that it deals with the past, and the past is experience. So the past has been lived, and people have come up with the solutions. So there are many ways in which the memories that have sedimented into various elements of Great Zimbabwe, the material, the immaterial practices associated with the place. One of them is particularly the sustainability of Great Zimbabwe itself. You might know that the team that looks after the dry stone walls and some of those earthen structures, what we call darker structures, you know, they use the indigenous knowledge, right? So these are people, these are local stonemasons who have knowledge which has been passed on from generation to generation. Their families were responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of Great Zimbabwe, and they are still doing it today. There is also a recent publication that talks about Great Zimbabwe and water management. So in terms of using the memory of waterscapes to think about how water would have been managed given, the potential of climate change and the like. Then there are also other resources like music. If you go on the hill, there is that cave which produces some very nice acoustics and so on, sacred music, sacred landscapes. What memories can we use to learn from the past? So there are quite a number of initiatives where the memories and the experiences from Great Zimbabwe are inspiring people, A, to look after the site, and then B, to improve their livelihoods and to also create employment. You can also add the political dimension if you want, but I will not go there.
Okay, Faya, would you like to unmute yourself? And then we'll circle back to Deandra, Matthew, and Deborah after that. You're still,
Thank you.
Miss Port,
Okay, I can, and now I can.
Okay, good.
Something happened. I want to thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And I had a written question in, which I don't see. It was a simple question, but a huge question. In fact, you partly answered it. And I asked, how do we consider the Great Zimbabwe as perceived and discussed today in reference to the smaller ruins often referred to as Zimbabwe's spread across the high veld? But I think that intellectually you answered the question already, so I will pass to the next person.
Thank you so much.
Okay, did you want to answer any of that or move on to the next
Yeah,
person?
okay, so just to say that Great Zimbabwe is not a lone ranger. It is one of the many, more than 500, depending on how you count, and the archaeological sites, the heritage places that look like Great Zimbabwe. They are in Mozambique, in South Africa, in Botswana, as well as in Angola. So built in the same style, precise placement method, without any binder, and this nice shaping of this granite or sandstone or whatever is the available raw material. Great Zimbabwe just happens to be the biggest. There's Kami, there's Danamombe, there's Tulamela in South Africa, there's Manyikeni in Mozambique, there's Domboshawa in Botswana. So it's so many of them. At some point, this is how people were living like. They were living in those places. But the way in which we tell narratives is we just associate them with the elites. That's taking away people. That's taking away some of the common folks. from the narratives. So part of the challenge associated with those studying those smaller places is how do we make sure that our narratives are inclusive? How do we make sure that they are also given a voice and that they are represented and we can learn from them?
Thank you.
Okay, circling back to Deandra, her question was dropped in the chat. It is, what do you hope for the future of African archaeology with your work in Great Zimbabwe? How can academia contribute to preparing future archaeologists to work with local communities to maintain their cultural heritage, especially in local languages?
Deandra, it's not fair to ask difficult questions. So the African archaeology, quite interestingly, though, I just emailed Gary Feynman a paper, which I contributed to a volume, which he is co-editing with Douglas Price. And the nature of the paper is the future of African archaeology. So it's something that I think about all the time. But archaeology. So let me take one step back and say that African archaeology is a very interesting subject, and African history, in the sense that when the nationalists, African nationalists, Kwame Nkrumah, Namzi Azikiwe, and so on, when they were fighting for liberation, they went to archaeology, they went to history for inspiration. When these countries become independent, African governments are no longer funding archaeology. They are no longer funding history. They are no longer funding, this heritage and so on. So one of the challenges that African archaeology is funding at the moment is a lack of funding and limited government support. And also, because the African archaeology is not well funded, what has been happening is that it is being left behind in terms of global practices. If you exclude South Africa, there are very few African countries that have got laboratories dedicated to archaeology, right? So application of stable isotopes, materials analysis, radiocarbon dating, and so on. So most of the research that you get then speaks to heritage management and so on. There's nothing wrong with that, except that if you don't have those tools, you can't teach them. And if you teach them, you can't have the practical way of demonstrating to students. So part of the future of African archaeology, or the present rather, is to build capacity, is to make sure that the questions that we engage with intersect with the challenges that communities are facing. How can archaeology contribute to food security? How can archaeology contribute to climate change? How can archaeology contribute to migration and global change? The more we do that, perhaps we might get we might find each other with our governments, and that way the curriculum can change, the tourism can improve, the well-being can also improve. Thank you.
Okay, Matthew Lowry asked the question, how would you approach an issue where two local indigenous groups are competing for things like artifacts and historical narrative?
That happens all the time, particularly if you add money to it. Add money to any equation and you see what happens. So that happens. In fact, around Great Zimbabwe, there are 4 chieftainships that are all fighting with each other for recognition as the official custodian. So we have to balance and make sure that everyone is included and everyone has got a right to participate without excluding anyone. I know that might sound a little bit theoretical and utopian, but in the case of Great Zimbabwe, this is happening because there is a management structure where people, different groups have got representatives, and issues are ventilated in that forum. And the government agency responsible for that also engages with communities, has programs that are aimed at benefiting people. But the key challenge is to make sure that Great Zimbabwe benefits many people and is not owned by any one individual or any one clan or any one politician.
Okay, Deborah Hurd is next. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you for your fantastic presentation. I had a question dealing with the material culture. So I noticed that the ceramics that you showed, some of them, quite a few of them actually, in form and in decoration, looked like Saharan ware. And also I'm thinking about the clappers that were used like in the Upper Nile Valley. So the question that I have, and I'm not suggesting anything about migrations, explaining the rise of Great Zimbabwe, but my question is there any other type of thing in the material culture that might suggest maybe an incorporation of some Saharan archaeological culture? Not saying, again, that it was a migration, but just an incorporation, and maybe this is a local form of it.
So you are asking a very interesting question, because when I was a student, I remember one of my professors was working on a plantation in Louisiana, and they had these low temperature ceramics, made by slaves. Their decorations were similar to the ones that were, made in Mozambique and other parts of Africa. So the question is, should we conclude that they came from Mozambique? So what I'm trying to get to is that yes, through culture contact, through down the line exchange, ideas are passed on from one group to another, from one person to another, through a relay system. But there is also the question of duplicate independent invention or discovery, that people in different parts of the world, so the Sahara would be at least 7,000 kilometers from Great Zimbabwe. At least, if we are talking of Chad and so that's quite a very long distance. But nevertheless, people were interacting. So in as much as there were these exchanges down the line, exchanges, some of which we don't yet have evidence for, we should also think about duplicate independent discovery, where humans in different parts of the world can find the solution to the same problem and have the same outcome without inspiration from the other. A good example being agriculture, starting in the New World, starting in the Middle East, no communication whatsoever. So these things do happen as well.
William Ngezi, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you so much. I agree with you, Professor, and my question is more aligned to the area where you mentioned about sustainable cultural, environmental, and social future, emphasizing on critical aspects that you have talked about. One of them is time, where you have said in Shona languages, Nguva in this case are referring to the, future preservation of the things that are coming. And I was just looking at the modern development and how fast time is in terms of development. And you as an archaeologist, what is your foresight, or what do you think will be the most important aspects to balance these upcoming modernizing aspects with the culture to build or to imply sustainability, or to still rebuild the perceived Zimbabwean social future that you have explained or described? Given that there's a lot of modernization here, how does that balance? How do you think, apart from the financial aspect that you're talking about, things are really changing?
Yes, things are, the only constant is change, right? So things will change, things will, but they will also remain the same, right? The more things change, the more they remain the same, which is why Great Zimbabwe is standing 1,000 years on, right? So there are also ethical questions. To what extent can you freeze a people's life? And say, don't modernize, don't do anything, So can't we accommodate both? That we accommodate change while people are, allowed to live their lives. And that is why there are also impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, cultural impact assessments. Those are all issues that are measures that are meant to ensure that the integrity of the landscape and its memories, they are preserved, while looking into what might come in the future. So it has to be about balance. If we cannot have a balance, then there will be problems, because then people will come in and there will be a lot of vandalism. You will also have a lot of problems. But the good thing about Great Zimbabwe is that the local people, they are excited, they are keen to participate, and they are having a good present, and they are looking forward to a good future by engaging with the different elements of Great Zimbabwe. Yes, I acknowledge there are challenges here and there, but such is the nature of life.
Next is George Halekas. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, you asked the question about, can we learn about sustainability from looking at Great Zimbabwe? And I wonder conceptually how you would approach trying to deal with that question. Would you use local approaches to sustainability to look at what might have occurred at Great Zimbabwe, or how would you approach that issue?
In a combination of approaches. So one of the most important variables when we talk about sustainability is demography, population, right? So which takes us to the idea in ecology, the ideas about the carrying capacity and so on. So we have modeled the population at the Great Zimbabwe through time, using some of these demographic tools combined with material culture. And we have also done some paleo-environmental reconstructions. So using stable isotopes to reconstruct what the environment would have been like, and how it would have changed through through time, and also looking at the consumption patterns in terms of what is being consumed in what quantities. Of course, we will never know how much of anything was consumed in full, but nevertheless, if we can play some mind games, and particularly how the broad spectrum economy was managed in terms of cattle, lands for agriculture, and for other things. So that is a multidimensional way in which we are looking at sustainability. And of course, this is all thrown into an envelope provided by local knowledge, and how people respond to environmental change, and also contribute to environmental change. So the agency, that's where oral traditions would also come in. So we are using all that information, combining it with the science and some Bayesian modeling to come up with some predictive models that we can think about. So we have also engaged with inequality. So what was the nature of social inequality at Great Zimbabwe? And they've done some number crunching in terms of applying some relevant econometrics models to think about that. So there's quite a lot. Hopefully, more of it will be published soon. The inequality piece is under embargo, but I think soon it should be publicly available, and you can see the methodologies that are being applied there.
Okay, we're running out of time, so we'll take one more question and then a couple of questions in the chat. Mbachu, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Professor. I'm Mbachu from African Studies Program here at Howard. Yeah, my question relates to African archaeology. Besides the points you raised earlier about funding and all those challenges that are there, I have you raised the issue of the knowledge systems of African knowledge systems with the knowledge from ancestors, or also the input from local informants, and not being really recognized in the colonial archaeology. What would be the nature of African, the nature, methodology, identity of African archaeology that in a way include those systems of knowledge, validate them along with laboratory and scientific methods, which you said we are also operating in that system, and the peer review and all that, and with African there, what way do you see forward? Thank you.
Fantastic. You are reminding me of an editorial that I did a year or two ago. And the question that I ask is, what is African archaeology? Is there, what do we mean when we say African archaeology? Is it a geographical label which refers to the archaeology that is done in Africa? Is it archaeology that is done by Africans? What do we mean when we say African archaeology? Whatever the answer you might have, just to say that things have changed, and at the moment colleagues they integrate different data sets. So Ethiopia has the advantage that it has a long history of encounters of literacy. So written records and texts, they are also a key component of understanding some of reconstructing some important parts of the Ethiopian past. So the general approach at the moment is, depending on the region where you are working in, you use the everything in terms of what is available. The science are like molecules, are like atoms, are like isotopes, right? But sometimes they don't interpret themselves. You need the oral traditions to interpret them. You need the culture to humanize the science. So that's why then archaeology perhaps is one of the most interdisciplinary fields around, because you are dealing with these mute objects. You analyze them, you get some information, you want to breathe life into them. So nowadays it's generally acknowledged. All colleagues working in different parts of the continent, they use oral traditions, they use the different techniques that are available. The only problem is that of helicopter science, where, you know, people from well-resourced countries, they just come in, get some samples, and then go back wherever they are without developing and without building capacity on the continent. Thank you.
Okay, 3 more questions. Hang in there. Duigu Urtemin says, thank you for this great work and presentation. Colonialized minds who produced confiscated past is very familiar to the Canadian archaeology and Indigenous history of the Turtle Island as well. I appreciate the suggestions of using local values and concepts of time for archaeological work. I am collaborating with Indigenous people who are not archaeologists, but more than my informants. It remains problematic to write grant applications and push back the system at the same time. Any suggestions?
Oh dear. And it's very interesting when you get entangled in all these places, things. You review grants, you are an editor, and at the same time you are also an activist. So the one would take a more pragmatic approach, depending on one's level. So there are some funding schemes that are top down. So in other words, the NSF would say to you that apply to this scheme, and this is what we expect. Or the Canadian Social Sciences Research Foundation would also say. But there are also some schemes that are bottom up that would say, give us your idea and tell us how good is it, so that we can fund you. So in as much as I accept that top-down approaches turn out to be very restrictive and very limiting, and there's also a lot of gatekeeping in there. You can't go against the tradition and so on. There's a lot of gatekeeping. I accept that, and I've also personally encountered that. However, there are also some schemes which are bottom up. My experience has been that those are the ones where you can pitch your ideas and you can get funded. And also sometimes we don't take the steps to even confront funders and say that why not write to John Yellen at the NSF and say, hey, John, you know what? We need funding which addresses this, and have a conversation. There are some countries where I was and I'm involved with those things. The Warner Grant Foundation has that engaged scholarship grant, which is also bottom up. The main criteria for that is that you must demonstrate a solid partnership with the community that you are working with. So there are some there are some things that are out there that one could try. And I do understand that some of these top-down funding schemes, yes, there is a lot of gatekeeping, but nevertheless, the winds of change are blowing. Things are changing, and people are recognizing that we need to be approaching these things using an open mind. That's optimistic, I know, but I'm an optimist in general.
Okay, and then what are some key aspects of Zimbabwe's history that have shaped its current identity?
Great Zimbabwe gave its name to the country. and the material culture from Great Zimbabwe, particularly one of the soapstone carved birds, that's the national emblem. That was the national emblem during the colonial time. That is the national emblem today. The ruling party, its coat of arms is Great Zimbabwe. Some of the opposition parties is Great Zimbabwe. The public broadcasters, their newsrooms, it's all Great Zimbabwe. So it's one of these places that is shaping and that has shaped the public discourse. The only thing that I must say is that it would be nice to see more investment into the conservation of Great Zimbabwe, more investment into ensuring that the local communities around Great Zimbabwe benefit more in terms of the being able to participate in the events that are happening there. They are part of the same landscape and so on. So those are the suggestions that I could make.
Okay, and then the last question from Dr. Mbai Cham from my department. Thanks for a great presentation, Dr. Chirikure. Do you work with institutions in Francophone Africa, such as IFAN in Dakar, Senegal?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that Ibrahima Chiao is a brother, and he is a very good friend of mine, and we collaborate on a number of things. I also work with EPA in Benin, Cotonou, and I also have some engagements with colleagues in Cameroon, but for reasons to do with colonialism, most of my engagement is with the English-speaking part of Africa, and where at the moment I'm working with the colleagues in Nigeria, the folks who are behind the development of Museum of West African Art and Archaeology, and just suggesting which is the aim to be a facility for the benefit of all of West Africa and Africa. And also I engage with the Baku at the Museum of Black Civilization in Dakar. In fact, one of my projects is on modern heritage of Africa, and Alisa Berry is a colleague that I work with, but not in as much detail as I do with some of my work, for example, on chocolate in Guatemala, or on porcelain in Longchan, China.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Was
Oh,
that
go
meant
ahead.
to be? Was that meant to be an invitation? Is he inviting me to join him?
Definitely come back to Howard. We want to see the musical instrument and the dancing.
Oh, fantastic.
Well, I want to thank you very much for that wonderful presentation and for answering all these questions. And to our French-speaking audience, thank you for joining us as well. Merci, au revoir. So we hope that you will join us again. We always have these African archaeological lectures every year. And thank you again, Professor Chirikure.
Thanks so much. Merci beaucoup.